Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome to the Beer Massif podcast. Been a minute, had a baby, 6 months old, but we decided to trek out into the beautiful yet immensely humid Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and talk to a man who knows a little bit about beer, and that man would be Jeff Alworth. What's going on, brother?
Well, I've been in Bethlehem 10 minutes, and I've already been really impressed, so it's cool to be here. I haven't spent much time in Pennsylvania.
What's your history with Pennsylvania, or even in northeastern United States in general?
My history with Pennsylvania is I've been in Philly for about one day, and then 10 minutes ago I came to Bethlehem. So that's that's my history with this region.
That could be a good or bad thing, but okay, yeah, continue.
Yeah. I've been to New York a few times, and my wife is from New England, so I actually go to New England often, every year.
Okay.
So I know New England quite well, but points south, it starts to get really spotty. So this is it's cool to be in an old industrial town.
Yeah.
We don't have that so much out in the West, and it's the history. You just really feel the history when you drive into this town.
Now, we're obviously going to be talking a lot about your second edition of the book, your beer Bible that came out, and it's not a question I really had prepped or anything like that, but it just makes me think, do you see a distinct pattern when you travel and visit these places, the culture in the town, the kind of beers they make, you know what I mean? Whether it be like here, you go into Bethlehem, do you expect some certain kind of beer once you see the actual city itself, or is it more just, who knows?
It's less to do with the type of beer that's served than the way the beer is drunk. So when I walked into this pub here at Bond Place, and got the kind of the vibe, the feng shui of the pub, it matched kind of what I expected. I expected a comfortable gathering hole where people, I'm just guessing, so I don't want to talk too much out of school, but I'm guessing this is a place that's been a good pub town for a lot of years. Like hardworking people like to drink beer,
mm-hmm.
and those make for good pubs, right? So
yeah.
You come to a place like Bethlehem, even long after the industry has left, you kind of expect that culture to still exist, that residue. In many places in America, you have to go to a strip mall to find a place to drink. There's not dive bars. There's not the culture of pub drinking.
Yeah.
And those are not my towns. So
yeah.
I instantly, when I walked into Bond Place, I instantly felt like this is home. This is my kind of place.
Well, you see a 3% cask ale on draft too. That kind of helps things too.
Yeah. Well, people who've read me know that I'm a big fan of cask, and I got to say, this thing, what's it called, Mooey?
Yeah.
It's awesome. It's really good. I mean, this is.
Yeah.
It's very hard to make a cask ale that would credibly be served in the UK, and this is one. It's really good.
And that's the one great thing about Bond, not to make it a Bond podcast, but it's but it kind of goes back to your book, because I think there's a cool kind of you'll be able to explain it better, is well, let's just jump into it now, is the difference between your first edition and second edition, and what you needed to add and remove, not just as far as styles go, but as far as creating the book. And let's just jump to the beginning. So when you made the original beer Bible, you were donezo in 2013, but you didn't even hit the shelves until 2015. So you had to wait 2 years. If you had to wait 2 years today, the book would be completely irrelevant. But there's so much.
I hope not.
Yeah,
please,
no.
Please keep buying it after 2 years.
No. But you know what I mean. Not irrelevant, but a bit dated. This one, I'm sure it went from you writing it to publishing quite a bit quicker. What was it like having to deal with that kind of difference, where it took you so long to see it hit the shelves, but this time you had to add a lot and have it come out quicker? Is it got to be a weird experience?
Yeah, it is in one way, and in another way. So, just to back up a little bit, to go back before the first one was published, when I was hired to write the first edition, I thought I knew a lot about beer. I thought I was qualified to write the book.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started to write it, and I realized I was not qualified to write the book. Somebody else probably should have been hired. I didn't know enough about beer to write it, so I had to do a lot of remedial work. I had to, I'd never been to Europe before, never drunk cask ale like the one I'm drinking right now in a pub in England. Never been to Germany, so I had a lot of work to do. And what I wanted to do when I wrote the book, was to have something that was a little bit more timeless. That captured, like drinking in England hasn't changed. The styles have changed, but fundamentally the experience of drinking a pint of cask ale in London hasn't changed in hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So I was trying to capture that quality, and I think I did pretty well on all of that. But then the big thing that really happened, IPA became the best-selling craft style in America in 2011, and then it just went on a rocket ship after that. And so that was really the big change, and not only in America, because now everybody makes IPA. If you go to any place where there's craft breweries, new breweries that are being opened, and I'm talking like Beijing or Mexico City or Bangalore, wherever you are, you're going to find American style IPAs, and they're not going to be made like they were in 2013 when I wrote the first edition of the book. So that was something I needed to deal with. So that you're right, that it was slightly bad luck that the one style that people cared most deeply about was the one that was under the most transformation when I started the first one.
But you said just before that you felt like you were underqualified to write the book once you actually got into it. That's kind of ends up being a blessing sometimes, because instead of telling your version of what beer is, you're kind of just telling what you see and what you learn, because you don't have a preconceived notion about what things are. Do you think that makes for, when you call a book the Beer Bible, that's kind of a big swing? You know what I mean? It's not like you're saying Jeff Alworth's book on beer, the Beer Bible. So what you're trying to do, I would assume, is be as, I don't want to say clinical, because beer is an art and stuff like that, but it just being very, very informational. And I kind of think having maybe not knowing everything is a good thing in that aspect.
You're exactly right. And once I realized that I didn't know as much as I thought I knew, I did my best to just start from scratch. It's like I bit off more than I can chew, so the best thing I can do is go back to basics. And you're exactly right. I think it was good to spend a lot of time reading experts and listening to experts and listening to brewers. And it was like a crash course in beer and sort of like a PhD in beer. And by the time it was published, I felt good about it. I thought I only had 2 years to write it, and I felt like it was certainly the most I could do in those 2 years. It was the biggest job I've ever done. It was almost caused a divorce. It was a big project, and at the end I felt like I understood beer, probably at order of magnitude more than when I started the project.
And when back to when you got into it, and you're like, maybe not qualified enough to write the book, but you come out of it with this just new kind of just large catalog of information and knowing a billion different things. See, you got to worry about that light struckness. Yeah. He's doing the right thing.
I'm starting to get a little skunk.
Not trying to cook it. Did it change you as far as how you drank beer? Because obviously, you thought you knew beer. You go in, maybe I don't know as much. Well, you go through the ringer of learning so much about it. But beer, it has to change you as a drinker.
Yeah, it totally did. I think two things that I noticed in my own experience was I was, more or less a beer geek in that I was deeply into the best beer, the most obscure beer, the biggest beer, like all that stuff. Just like beer geeks often do when you start at Budweiser, then you go deep and you go into this place. And there were a bunch of styles that I had ignored, and traveling around the world, going to breweries where I talked to a brewer who'd been there for 40 years making a particular beer style that I didn't think I admired, and touring that brewery, which might have been around for 200 years. All of a sudden, I gained massive new appreciation for a beer style I didn't think I appreciated. So that changed me. I started to really appreciate, particularly I have to say, the German tradition. German lagers, I could have taken or left before I was writing the Beer Bible, and afterwards they became among my favorite styles, and I really appreciate the craft and history that goes into them. So that was one piece. And the second piece is, I came to see that beer is culture. It's less to do about what's in the pint than what's behind the pint. So I had the great fortune, because I was forced by this book to go travel through Europe, to go from one country to the next. And, you see how people drink beer differently. Mm-hmm. You see the way beer functions in the drinking process. So the difference between drinking 8 cask ales when you go to a pub in Britain versus drinking 2 really strong beers at a cafe in Belgium. You see that. And then you just also talking to the brewers. They have such incredibly strong opinions that are formed by the context in which they were taught how to brew and which they were taught how to drink. So you realize it's not really about flavor. It's not like ice cream and you're just going to come up with a new flavor. It's about all of this. We're just seeing the tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg itself is the interesting thing. And it's this ball of history and culture and technique and process, and that was super cool. And then I really related to beer entirely different afterwards.
And now to take like a ridiculously large jump ahead, how do you accomplish that behind the pint during a pandemic? You're going to write a new book, and then you want to get that story. You want to be face to face with that brewer. You go into the second edition, and you want to do that, but even if you want to do that, you're kind of hamstrung to a certain extent.
I mean, fortunately, I finished all my travel right before the pandemic hit. So that was really good. I went on a big tour of Europe, and I got back maybe 2 months before the pandemic hit. Which you're right. If I don't think I could have written the book. We would have had to delay it, and then at least a year, maybe more than that, before where I could write it. Because another thing that was remarkable is we think of European beer as not being very changeable, but that's not true at all. The changes that I saw, particularly in Britain and Belgium, were remarkable over the 5-6 years since I'd been there before. So it's incredibly important that I traveled to those places, and I would have. It wouldn't have been possible. I may have written the book, but it wouldn't have been a very good book.
Well, let's flip that on its side then. I'm not trying to say the pandemic's a good thing, but you do all that, and then you come back and you have no choice but to sit down and write a book.
Right.
So does it end up being a good thing, or does that end up being like both good and bad, to where you're kind of just as a writer? I'm not a writer, so I don't know if you're stuck and all you have is one thing to work on. Is that a way you can work?
Well, to the extent that my filter of beer as culture was in place, it became even more in place, because all I was left with was cans of beers that we were buying at breweries,
Mm-hmm.
and I have a blog, I do social media, and what I could see was we were all still drinking beer, but you extract the social piece out of it, and all the fun is drained away. The reason we like to drink beer is not just because it tastes good and it's mildly alcoholic. It's because we're sitting there with our friends and we're talking about beer, and we're having an experience when we're drinking the beer, whether it's at a pub or at a wedding or at a tailgate, whatever it is. Like, that's why we care about beer.
Yes.
And I think there was a brewer this spring, so spring 2021, as we were thought coming out of this, said, we're getting through this and it's fine and my business is going to survive and that's great, but beer is supposed to be fun, and the whole reason I got into this, I don't mind the 16-hour days, I don't mind the hard work, I don't mind the stress of the business, potentially dying or succeeding, as long as I get the thing that I got into it for, which is I want to hang out with my friends and drink beer. I want to make new friends and drink beer. It's a social beverage. You take that away and all of it just feels terrible. It's just, then it just becomes 16-hour.
The linchpin, yeah.
Yeah, so that as I was transcribing my interviews from Europe and thinking about that as I was writing the book, I think it was actually a little bit more poignant and a little bit more, it came into sharper focus, the idea that, beer is really about the social aspect. At the end of the day, there's this communication, all these styles, they come through a variety of different influences, but one of the most important is the communication between the drinker and the brewer. This kind of harmonics that comes, so that, they drink Helles in Munich and they drink IPA in Portland, Oregon, where I come from. That's a weird, witchy process, and it's a social process. It's entirely social, and you take that out of it, and it's like, I think we all lost our moorings. We didn't really know where we were, and because I was working on the book, I had a strong sense we would get back there eventually. It's a 12,000-year-old beverage, so I knew beer would come back, and I was thinking of the social aspect a lot.
Is this kind of your first like sojourn out and about to really post pandemic, as far as going out and about and kind of getting out and amongst the people as related to like when you did the research for the book?
Yeah, beer wise, it is. My mother was living in Arizona, and she went through a health crisis after COVID, and I had to move her up to Portland. So I was going back and forth to Arizona, but not for beer drinking.
Yeah.
It was just like getting on a plane. So the first time I got on a plane was to go to Arizona. But yeah, no. They do have one brew pub in Yuma, Arizona, where she's from, and I happened to be, it was classic scene. I went to the brew pub, and I was drinking beers, and there's this guy who's mopping up the floor, and he's kind of chatty, so I talked to him. Turns out he owns the brewery, and he's the brewer. It's like, oh, yeah, you're cleaning up. Brewing is glamorous. Of course you are. Of course you're the brewer. And we had a great time, and he was making some really nice beer. So I had this little flash, a little memory.
Just like like clicking in your brain, like yeah.
Oh yeah, I remember this. This is awesome. I want to do more of this. Yeah. So it's true. This is fun. It's great to come out and go to breweries.
Breweries, see dogs, see John Halls. It's just one of the best things in the history of mankind.
Unfortunately, we don't see so many John Halls in Oregon.
It happens.
He used to travel a lot, but not so much anymore.
So we'll rewind back to the end of edition 1. You published a book, and what was it like to publish a book that you originally kind of felt maybe a little underqualified for, like putting it out in the world, putting yourself out there in the world? It had to be pretty hectic.
Well, I was super worried about all of that, and even before it was published, I decided the best way for me to deal with my anxiety is to give chapters to people who are experts. So each chapter has a history section when we're talking about beer, history section, brewing section, and different. So there's different experts. So I got experts in history to look at the chapters that the pieces of the chapter dealt with history. I got brewers to look at the brewing stuff, because one thing that I was developing a neurosis that I was going to really make a fool of myself, and I thought I would much rather have them privately tell me I'm an idiot and let me fix it than have this thing get published and then have that go. So that actually was a strong way to build confidence heading into the publication. And it's 650 pages long. There's mistakes in it.
Yeah.
And then they'll grow over time. They'll be more obvious over time. I get that. It is if you're going to write stuff down, you're going to get stuff wrong. And I know that. But you don't want it to land with a thud, as everyone says. This is just a disaster of misinformation. I can survive being corrected over time, but you're right. I didn't want that to happen.
And what was the reception like for you from the people that, I don't want to make it sound weird, but the people that you gave a shit about? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
What was that like?
It was positive, and it was really gratifying. It was good to have, I feel like I write for brewers, and they're the people that I'm most interested in the process. I think they're the people who think most deeply about the product. I love people who start breweries and spend their money and their sweat. I have an enormous amount of respect for owners. But at the end of the day, when I walk into a brewery, I always just go talk to the brewer. And so I was interested to see what they thought. And so getting feedback from them that they liked the book, and they found it's always wonderful when somebody says, oh yeah, I didn't know that thing about X, history, or I didn't know that the British did this process or whatever it was. Whenever a brewer tells me that, I feel like, yeah, all right, good. This is a good day.
That, like, so you get that feedback, you get that positive feedback from the brewers, the people, like I said, give a shit about kind of that you're doing something that is not just well done, but also positively presented. You move from there, and then it's Beervana blog, it's Beervana podcast. How does going through the rigmarole of writing that book, writing the first book, and then immersing yourself in both the blog and the beer podcast, how did that change your approach leading into edition 2?
Well, it's an interesting question, which I'd never considered before. Yeah, it all just kind of accrues. And I guess coming into edition 2, I didn't have the same anxiety and neurosis that I didn't know anything about beer. So that was good. There were a couple of things.
But it has to be like a double-edged sword. People might assume you know everything about beer now. So now it's an expectation of you to deliver. You know?
I mean, beer is cool. So this part of beer is a double-edged sword. People like beer and they know what they like, and they don't give a shit if you think you know more about them. And so, beer keeps you humble. And so it was nobody has ever really looked to me as an expert. The most that's happened is brewers will, email and say, so, when you were at the Czech Republic, when they were making a Tomave, what was did they use caramel malt? What was the dark malt that they used? It was Munich malt. What was their mash schedule? Like that stuff.
That's so they're trying to steal secrets is what they're trying to do, is what you're saying.
And I'm an open book. I'm happy to do all that. Yeah. So that's like the most kind of, I guess, the most I get back from it. Beer fans are pretty confident. It's like whiskey fans and wine fans. They're always looking to writers to say, this, you should look for this flavor note. This is what it should taste like. Beer fans don't care about that. They don't look to me for, they're like, this is an awesome beer, and if you don't like it, you're an asshole. So, and that's great.
Well, let's talk about that. How was not just the beer drinker, but the brewer? Now ownership is a big thing compared to back then. It was almost exclusively if you were the brewer and the owner, because there was no kind of we're going to make $1 billion off of this. It had to be much of a different experience, I would imagine, more specifically in England, which hazies and hoppy stuff has gone crazy over there. What was the difference between then and now, dealing with the people who make it and own it and do it?
Yeah, I mean, England especially was super cool to see because the beer had really changed. So cask ale, which is, I'm drinking a cask ale here. I consider it the most crafted beer style on the planet. Because not only do you have to do this, make it properly in the brew house, then it has to go to the pub and be handled properly and dispensed properly. It's like a really fussy process, right? So it's a very cool beer style. And part of the problem with cask beer is that we're mostly talking about cask bitter, and it's mostly been frozen in amber for 30 years, which was the case when I was there to do the first edition research. So when I went back in 2019, late 2019, I discovered that breweries now, including old venerable breweries like Fuller's and Lee's, I went to Manchester, they're making, but also more modern breweries who do cask beer style, they're making 4%, 3.8% bitters using American hopping techniques to produce incredibly juicy flavors in their cask ales that Americans would be unable to ever produce because of the way they think about base malts, the way they think about yeast, the way they think about water chemistry, all these things, and of course this dispense system itself is also something that totally mystifies Americans. So I was getting these beers. So, America has craft beer that was founded on British brewing. Pub beers were like that. We got them from England.
Yep.
We completely perverted them, turned them into American brewing, and now the English are recreating them in their own fashion. So it's like ping pong back and forth across the Atlantic. And now the English are making these insanely good cask ales that are really juicy and made with modern hops. It totally blew my mind. And I was there. Unfortunately, the English are really they're kind of embarrassed by their own national tradition.
I was going to ask this. Yeah.
For God's sakes, guys, you are making some of the best beer in the world. You should be totally bragging about this.
Yeah,
awesome.
That's what I was curious. I was going to ask you about that. It's such a proud tradition for those beers, and to take such new school technique and more, especially take it from American hops or American technique and to put it in, it just make great. It's amazing. Why you even blinking an eye at it? Oh, it's not perfect traditional. It has to be fantastic. And Hopefully over here they start doing that stuff. But like you said,
Yeah,
I've
I've been trying to tell people,
do it.
you guys got to try to make this juicy cask they're making over in Britain because it's awesome and you guys would love it. And there's a few brewers, like I think Bond Place is one of them, who get the base style. It's like you can do abstract art if you know how to do art. It's you can mess with the English language if you understand grammar, that kind of thing. A brewer that can make a beer like the one that I'm drinking could easily apply American techniques to this and figure out how to make it taste in harmony and balance, because the big problem with Americans is, we always, our attitude is more.
Yeah.
So you can't use more on certain beer styles, and this is one of them. A cask ale, it's 4%.
I will say this as one of the world's semi-biggest curmudgeons. That would be, John's partner in crime is the biggest, but I'll say it was the second biggest curmudgeon. Not yet. Anyway, he seemed to be coming around. It seems like a lot of like traditional styles are not just being like. It doesn't seem like a fad. It seems like a lot of lager and lower ABV sessionable ale is starting to become more of a thing in the United States.
And brewers love those kinds of beers. If you ask a brewer, if you go to a brew pub and you see that they have 17 double IPAs on tap, and then they have one 4.2% Saison and a Pilsner, and you ask them, which one do you drink? Oh, I drink the Pilsner.
Yeah.
Because those are the kind of beers they like to brew. It's a commercial enterprise, so you got to sell people what they want to drink, and there's nothing wrong with it. A good double IPA. It's a very American style, and it's as culturally relevant here as Helles is in Munich, so it's fine. But I think that there's the question then of technique, and I think most Americans don't get cask ale in particular. They really get lagers a lot better than they get cask ale, so I find a lot more credible examples of German and Czech style lagers than I do credible examples of what we would consider a good English cask ale. So then if you ask them to take to introduce an American element into a cask ale, you're getting into big trouble, because most Americans are going to be like, I understand America, and I will just muscle this thing around. You really have to be like in tune with the cask ale, in order to get that juiciness without destroying what makes a cask ale so special.
Maybe that's it's a good thing the lager came. They have to crawl before they walk. They gotta, not that lagers are easy and it's crawling, but you know what I mean. Get a little bit more kind of keen on what they're trying to execute and executing it, rather than just shoving stuff into a cask ale.
Yeah, and I have a lot of respect for lager in the United States. I just continue to encounter great lagers in the United States. So American brewers can do subtlety, but it's a matter of understanding ingredient and process, and I think English cask ale has been passé for so long. Most brewers are going to be under 40 years old, so they're not going to have been raised in that era in which cask ale was revered. And sometimes they're, really young and maybe never even had a crappy English style beer. So yeah, it's a lost art.
There's Sam the man. What's going on, brother? How you been?
Oh, good.
This is Sam the owner.
Yeah. There you go.
That's for me. Thank
Sure,
you
it is
very
now.
much.
Hey Sam.
Can I get you another beer?
Let me pace myself. Yeah, thanks.
Long
We just
night.
came from another brewery, of course. So
Yeah.
I gotta.
PDR right here.
So you were bridging that gap between edition 1 and edition 2. There's so much to pack in there, because you're talking about it's almost like an industrial revolution to the modern day technology age. Like the exponentially just gets quicker and quicker, more and more and more. So you're talking about from when you finished putting the other book to bed in 2013, you're talking about start working on a book and get it published up into 2021. How did you, because you still have to stick to a format of pages, how do you not just put in what needs to be put in, but nix what you have to nix? You can't keep everything in the book. That's got to be the worst.
Yeah. Speaking of English styles, I had separate chapters on brown ale and mild ale, and even in England, mild ale is basically extinct. I mean, it's just not a.
He's going to punch you right now.
It's
by
not.
the way.
It's just. It does not warrant its own chapter. It's just. It's such a tiny percentage of world production. You really have to go far and wide to find either a brown or a mild, and so I collapse those into one chapter. Wit beer used to be a really big style.
Especially for you out there, Widmer Brothers, pretty much. That's what that's.
Well, that I'm talking more the Belgian style.
Okay.
Yeah. So like it was.
Yeah.
Blue Moon got this. They rode this rocket ship, and Whitbeer had its big moment, and it's really not very popular now, even in Belgium. So I had given it its own chapter, and I absorbed it into the Belgian ale chapter, which includes things like Belgian Bruins, which are not very common, and they're actually not that different than a Belgian pale ale. Like, that's one approach I had for the book is, if you understand the technique and the philosophy behind a beer style, you can make some changes within that genre, and it doesn't actually change the fundamental thing. So like if you're brewing a Bavarian lager, it can be stronger and be a Bock. It can be lighter colored and be a Helles. It can be darker and be a Dunkel. But brewers think about these beers the same way. They just use different base malts. They make them the same way. They think about them the same way. Fundamentally, they're very similar beers, except in the way that the ingredients are put together. And with American IPA, as another example, I tried to break it down. To your point, at the start of the podcast, you were asking, like, how do you sort of future-proof this so it's still relevant in 2 years? And I think for a long time we've been able to see the trends in IPAs that I can't imagine leaving, which is this. So leave aside West Coast versus hazy. Yeah. What we've seen is a trend towards juiciness, right? So like the flavor and aroma of hops.
More.
Yeah. It's just been that has everywhere you go, whether you're in New England, West Coast. When I was doing the first edition of the Beer Bible, the book tour, I was in Tampa, and it was a brew pub. I had an event at a brew pub that had been open like 6 months, and they had one of the juiciest IPAs I'd ever encountered. They were home brewers. I was like, they get it in Tampa. It's like everywhere is coming to this coherence with trying to pull the most flavor and aroma out of American hops that they can. So whether you're adding lactose, whether you're finishing at a gravity of 5 Plato or 2 Plato, whether it's got 80 IBUs or 40 IBUs, American IPAs are headed in this direction of should taste like tropical fruit, should smell like tropical fruit, maybe pine, and grapefruit, but basically they should be insanely aromatic and flavorful. And there's going to be, we have seen every variation, even to this point. You got black IPAs, you have session IPAs, you have Belgian IPAs, you have fruit IPAs. You can just white IPAs, black and white IPAs, like red IPAs. You just go to the color spectrum. We've had all of them, so you can kind of imagine in your mind trying to get your hands around this style and thinking, actually, it's true. I'm certain that the second this is published, we're going to see variations on this theme, and yet we shall see if I'm correct about this, but I have a sense that they're going to fit within this kind of general national tradition towards intensity of hop aroma and flavor, and we're seeing a lot on the breeding side. So we have new hops coming online all the time. So now we have more coconutty hops, and at a certain point they're going to invent a hop that's like
they're coming out so fast. They're just numbers now. They don't even just and eventually they give them a name. So it's HBC, blah 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 blah.
Yeah. So we may have like a vein of strawberry hops at some point that just like taste like strawberries, and so then we'll have a whole range of you'll have like. Imagine my future strawberry hop and Sabro, and it's like coconut strawberry IPAs, right? Yeah, so you can see how that kind of unrolls, but it's not fundamentally different. It's just a different flavor profile in terms of the way they're made and the way people want them to taste and the way they think about them. I think we've in the last decade, it's been 10 years since IPAs have been the dominant style in American craft brewing. I think we can see throughout that entire 10 years this trend towards flavor intensity, aroma intensity, and the question of bitterness kind of depends on region, but definitely dialed way back from its 2005 time, and it's either a more assertive balancing note or a less assertive balancing note, but basically that one's off to the side. I think we kind of understand IPAs now. So we'll see if I'm right in 10 years.
Well, it's on the record. Don't worry about that. Speak to the difference or change or adoption of American hops in England, because you're talking about when you went back there, when you were there first to do the first edition, you went back this time. You said not, Europe as a whole, but England specifically, there's so many breweries that have adopted crazy American IPA, whether it be Cloudwater or Verdant or any of those larger breweries. What was that like? It's not that long. It's long, but it's not. You're talking about an 8-year stretch. You probably landed and you go walking into like Verdant. You're like, what? This is like I'm walking into Monkish or something at this point. It's had to be such a crazy shock to a certain extent.
I had the weird, serendipitous good fortune of meeting Paul Jones, one of the two founders and now sole owner of Cloudwater, in San Francisco 5 years ago, something like that. And they just started Cloudwater, and he was traveling from Seattle to San Diego on a fact-finding mission. He was tasting every IPA he could taste, and he took that information back to Cloudwater. And you were right. When I went to Manchester in 2019 to talk to Paul, it was like, okay, you have an English accent, and yet, you might as well, be totally American, making American-style beers. In fact, he even has a barrel program making wild ales that looks very American, which is another kind of minor American innovation. So there is that tradition, and you're seeing, start I think with I would give the Colonel in London credit as like the first one to really go all in on American style beer, and they did it so early that their beers were very bitter and very
beautiful,
West Coasty.
Beautiful big brown bottles with a brown label.
Right. Yeah. Very simple labels, like very iconic. Yeah. And now it's evolved into the more hazy realm, the juicier, the fruitier realm. But what I think, to go back to my earlier point about the juicy cask thing, is where it becomes very interesting, and this is even happening at Cloudwater, is the sort of, so that's the return from the United States, and then the first thing English brewers do is they do what anybody does when you're brewing a style of beer from another place, is you try to brew it as perfectly true to style as you can before you start messing around, adding your own stuff. And I think what will be really interesting is watching English brewers, whether they're Cloudwater or traditional cask ale breweries, using American, and they always have that. In England, they have a category of New World hops. So they throw American and South African and New Zealand and
all lump them all in there.
It's like they're New World hops, and they're a lot closer to New Zealand than we are in the United States. So, and I think they're just as far. I think probably the Nelson hop yards of New Zealand are as close to England as the Willamette hop yards in my home state of Oregon are. So from them, it's like, it's really far away, and they're New World, and they taste really expressive, and that's what we care about. So they're using all these different hops. But what's fascinating is, when you look at what we think of as the quintessential expression of American brewing right now, the hazy IPA, well, what really cracked that open? First of all, dry hopping. Where did that come from? We learned it from England, right? That's like an English tradition. It's not only English. When I was in Belgium in 2019, Jan de Baets at Brasserie de la Seine said, oh yeah, actually Belgians have been doing dry hopping for centuries too, which blew my mind. I'd never heard that. Really, Belgians? Because that's really not a hoppy place. But so it's not something Americans invented. Dry hopping is an old tradition, but we learned it from Britain. And then the really killer app in the hazy IPA is the English yeast strain, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, it's. I mean, a lot of people out there don't know. You're not really dealing with a wide swath of yeast here. It's usually either London or Conan or what is it? There's probably Quebec is probably one of the biggest ones because of turnover time. But
yeah. Well, in England, they're like, all these Americans are making these hazy IPAs out of our yeast. Yeah. Like, we should just figure out new yeast strain. So at Cloudwater was super fascinating. There's an old brewery in Manchester where Cloudwater is located called Lee's.
Yeah. Lee's Harvest Ale is one of my favorite beers in the history of mankind.
Right. And they make an amazing bitter that I super love. I've never tasted their bitter because...
Moonraker? What is it, their bitter?
I think it's just called
bitter.
Yeah, okay. I think so. Yeah. it has a very strong green apple note.
Okay.
And Americans will think that's an acetaldehyde quality, an off flavor of incomplete fermentation. And when I was drinking it with a brewer, he's like, "Do you taste the aldehyde note? It's a very prominent note, but we like it, and it's always been a feature of our brewing." I'm butchering I'm sorry. Anybody in the UK who's listening, I apologize for that. But it was
they're getting a chuckle. They're not offended.
I was really impressed that he immediately called it out, and it is awesome in the beer. It's so great. Anyway, Paul is friends with Lee's, and they work together, and he's starting to experiment with Lee's yeast to make his hazy IPAs.
I had a Cloudwater beer with JW Lee's yeast.
Yeah.
I forget, but it was a small beer. It wasn't a big beer.
Right.
I forget what it is. Was it another? No. That was a collaboration they did. Sorry, that's Keith off he never talks anyway. No, it was actually just a Cloudwater It was a Cloudwater non-collab, a straight Cloudwater beer that someone sent me from the UK that was just made with JW Lee's yeast. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So it's like all of a sudden the English are like, wait a second, this American, and I'm doing air quotes.
That works in podcasting.
That's right. This American style of brewing actually borrows heavily from our tradition. What the hell? Why aren't we capitalizing on this? We are the ones that have these old yeast strains that produce these insane esters, and they don't have to produce. So to your point, when Americans make hazy IPAs, they so often use the same yeast strains that the ester profile is pretty similar, and so the flavor profile, no matter which hops you use, has a similarity. Well, you have this playground. If you're in England, you have this playground of all these different yeast strains, and many of them won't work great with American hops, but a few of them will, and we don't have access to them in the way that the English do.
Do you think that's more of a this is just me shooting from the hip on something like that, but it sounds like that's more of just a money thing, not necessarily as far as cost, but as far as like American breweries, they need to produce consistently, they need to produce what they need to produce, and they need to produce it now. So why would they veer away from this yeast profile they're so used to? Where over in England, they're kind of still a little bit in their infancy when it comes to these kind of beers, so they can experiment. And if it tastes like new but a little bit like old, maybe people will get into it more.
There's that, and there's also the thing that for so long American ale breweries used the Chico strain, the Sierra Nevada strain, which is super neutral. So for many American brewers, the flavor of yeast is like, oh my God, I put this beer in my beer and I get flavor. It's so interesting. Whereas that is 100% part of English brewing, so they already really understood that that when you look at the flavor profile of a good English cask ale, you've got the base malts, which the Americans also are not very clear on how that contributes. You've got the yeast profile. You may have water treatment, so Burtonizing and all that stuff, and of course you have the way the hops fit into that, and when you're drinking a cask ale, all of those components should come through. So it's not like you're just irradiating it with hop flavor.
Yeah.
You're trying to you want to taste the malt, right?
Yes.
So you can't irradiate it with with hops, or else it's just you
lost.
Nuke it.
Yeah.
And so Americans had so long been used to irradiating their beer with hops, and the Chico strain was great for that because it got out of the way. So that was always considered a great virtue until the moment they realized esters existed.
Yeah.
And so now brewers are trying to find esters, but they're not that familiar. And I think in a production schedule, if you know exactly how a yeast is going to perform and how hazy it's going to make the beer and how it's going to interact with the hops, it makes a lot of sense. You got your London 3, you know exactly how London 3 is going to behave. You've tasted it, it's familiar, people like it. Stick with London 3. English, who already have a sense of how yeasts work and flavor the beer and work with hops and work with malts and like play together, they have a big advantage. They get how that's going to work. So if they're working with the American tradition, they understand these other elements. They have an advantage by having a head start with the understanding these other elements, and they can, I think, more adeptly figure out which one of these yeast styles is going to work with New World hops, as they call them.
You referenced a couple times about kind of the back and forth between the United States and England and that kind of ping pong effect about, we take from them, they take from us. Did you see anything in particular on their end of things? Is it the cask end of things that you might see coming over here? Is there another return volley from that end that you could see kind of coming over this way? Is it process? Is it that yeast, or is it too soon to even tell?
Yeah, maybe it's that yeast. I mean, I've seen a great insularity in the United States right now. Americans no longer look to Europe at all, which is the natural progression of mature beer culture. If you're in Munich and you were trained at Weinstefan, you're not looking at what the Belgians are doing.
Yeah.
You're not thinking like, I wonder if my Dunkel would be improved by using Belgian Pilsner malt, or some.
You're fired.
Yeah, refermenting exactly. It just doesn't happen, and Americans are now kind of siloing like that. Americans believe they know how to make beer, and they believe that all the information that they need is contained in the United States, and so they're not looking elsewhere so much. And I want to say, I know there's 9,000 breweries in the United States, and if anyone hears this who's a brewer and you're looking to Europe, I get that there are some of you out there, but for the most part, there's a lot.
Yeah, you're not talking in absolutes.
That's right.
Yeah, but and it's all almost like kind of exciting to a certain extent because necessity and mother of invention. So when you have I know everything complex, again, not that that's everybody, and we have what we need to, then you start to get a little bit of a slowdown, I guess you would say. You could see it in the hazy IPA style.
Yeah,
it's really becoming not everybody trying to innovate, it's everybody trying to make the best version of the thing they're already doing. So somebody's got to take up the mantle. Who's going to do it, Keith? Canadians? Scandinavians? Who's it going to be? That's why they don't call him the best color man in the business for nothing, guys. Anyway,
he's a thoughtful man.
He's
actually considering this, which this format does not lend itself to thoughtfulness.
It does not, and I'll let you know right now, Keith would just go, I don't know. That's what would have happened, so I'm just kind of fast forwarding, yeah.
I think we're going to see stuff happen in other parts of the world. Whether it's been a while, but I was in Mexico, I think in 2018, and it's very exciting. In Mexico, they had a weird distribution thing, which completely suppressed the industry, and they changed the law, and a bunch of craft breweries opened. And so they have...
So it was the United States, is what you're saying.
Exactly. It felt like the United States 1985. It's like all these young people who are getting into beer are just super excited about innovation, and they're trying everything, they're throwing everything on the wall, and it's amazing. And so I think maybe, I don't know if it's going to happen in Mexico, but you see that in other countries too. And it's possible that, because they're looking to the United States, they're looking to Europe, they're looking everywhere, they're looking locally. They're like, what if we put this kind of cactus in the beer? What will happen then? And that's fun stuff.
You were talking about going various stuff. I know someone who has a brewery in China. There's a bunch in Japan. I just had a brewery from South Korea the other day, and it was a hazy, robust IPA. Sure, it's a hazy IPA, but it was a hazy IPA from South Korea. That was a very cool thing to see. And then when you see breweries starting to innovate and not just do quantity and try to make interesting styles, you're going to have to put your own flora and fauna in there and just kind of make kind of cool stuff, which is really cool to see.
Totally, yeah, I'm excited. I mean, that's the other thing I learned writing this book, is that it's a global. Beer is global, and it's local. It's definitely local, but it's also global. And brewers talk to each other, and they share information. And the one thing I would bet on, I'm really bad about predicting things, so keep that in mind. But the one thing I would predict is cool stuff will continue to happen in beer, and it may not happen in the United States. We're so used to leading the world. But it's possible. It's possible. I would just suggest gently that it's possible that the next great innovation will not happen in the United States.
Full disclosure, about 20 minutes ago, I said something, and I'm going to predict the future, and we'll check back in a couple of years because it's going to be true. I think that you said that. I'm paraphrasing to a certain extent.
I always predict things, and I'm always wrong, and I'm aware of that, and yet I boldly still predict things.
A couple quick questions before we go, because you're going to start setting up for your Q&A. At the beginning, I said, beer moves so fast that, a couple of years it'll be irrelevant. That's a very harsh word. I probably shouldn't have used that. But when you make a first edition to a second edition, do you write it with... How do you write that? Like, my first inclination would be like, I'd write that as if somebody already read the first edition. So I'll give first edition, but add on. Whereas if you write the second, then you can be like, wait a minute, if no one's never read the first edition, I can't leave anything out. Like, how do you find a balance? That would stress me out. That would be my probably biggest stressor in doing such a thing as someone who writes nothing.
My assumption is that no one ever reads anything I write, so I
Well,
strive.
I understand that. No one listens to anything I say. So.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where I'm starting from. It's like, I assume you haven't read this book, and we'll go from there. And if you have, you maybe skip through these few chapters that you're familiar with. But yeah, no, there's whatever, 350 million Americans, and what is it?
All of you need to buy this book. So if all 350 people that are watching, million people are listening to this right now, just buy
only
one.
half of them are beer drinkers, right? So let's keep that in mind. Well, there's
the other
children
half can gift it to the people who are beer drinkers, so they have doubles.
I've seen my sales stats, and I've seen my traffic numbers on my blog, and I know that I don't have that kind of traffic. So I'm certain that the people who haven't read me are vastly outnumber the people who have.
Before we go, I actually have to just kind of get your kind of comments on this. Let's talk about sake for a hot second.
Yeah, that's one of my new chapters.
Okay, yeah, that's what I want to talk about. Why include sake? Because I can see why, and I can also see why not.
Well, writing the Beer Bible the first time made me realize it's ancient. And actually, in the period of time since I wrote the first edition to the second edition, there was a great archaeological dig in a place called Göbekli Tepe, and I may be mispronouncing that, but I've never heard anybody say it out loud, which is in modern-day Turkey, which pushed the date for known human brewing back to 10,000 BC, which is 12,000 years ago. We're talking like 7,000 years before civilization. Insanely early. Humans have been making beer forever, and if you go to any place on the planet where grain is grown, so you're talking about sorghum in China and Africa, you're talking about corn in the Americas, obviously wheat and barley in Europe, they make beer. And there's this chauvinism that says beer should only be made out of barley or maybe wheat, and anything else is something other than beer. But it's unsustainable and unsupportable if you kind of look at the history of beer in the world, so in Asia, rice is the most prevalent grain, and the way that sake brewers make sake is insane. To work with rice is a totally off the grid thing. If you think you know beer, look at what sake brewers do. It's totally random. You just have, it's a different kind of grain, and so you have to do a bunch of different stuff. You have to use these mold spores to do the conversion of the grain of the rice, which is insane. It's very unusual, and they have yeast that will ferment their beer to like 20%, which I remember when I was first reading about beer, they were like, yeast. Saccharomyces will crap out after 12, 13, 14%. Yeah. It's like becomes toxic. Well, they've never been to Japan because the Japanese will tell you that's actually not true. Saccharomyces can go all the way up to 20%. And there are breweries in Japan, single locations that have been there hundreds of years. Maybe we always thought it's a lie. Weinstefan says that they've been around since 1401 or whatever it is. That's not true, actually. It's a whole nother. That's like 5 minutes. We don't need to spend on this.
It's Yingling, Europe edition. Yeah,
it's just not true. But there are places in Japan where they've been brewing for several hundred years in the same place. So it's and there's a whole culture around sake brewing and sake drinking that's super cool, and it's honestly really chauvinistic that we would say that's something other than beer. And the second that I published the first edition, I had a section on sake, but not a chapter. And I immediately felt like that was a real problem. And that was before the United States started going through a reckoning of white supremacy. And I was like, this is another example of the way in which white people see whiteness wherever they go, and they don't tend to see other stuff. And I felt really guilty about that, so I did my best to do sake right and proud. And I don't think that's going to be the most popular chapter, but it's an awesome chapter, and you should read it.
And honestly, I'm a novice when it comes to sake. Like, I like it, I enjoy it, I drink it when I can. actually, oddly enough, 30 minutes north from here, there's a sake brewery.
Nice.
Yeah, and I go there every so often, and I'm not going to sit here and say it's the best sake I ever had in my life, but I have a sake brewery 30 minutes away from me in the middle of nowhere in New Jersey.
That's really cool.
And it's such a great beverage, and I understand why it can be in there. I can see some people arguing not or whatever, but just to not for you to put it in the first one, but just then double down and go a little bit harder. Have you always been like a big sake drinker, or was you doing this chapter on sake kind of like you doing the first book, or you know what I mean, like learning a bit more, getting a little bit more comfortable?
Yeah, I think the latter. It was I had drunk sake. We have one of the first American sake breweries in Oregon, out in Forest Grove, which is maybe an hour from Portland, and so I was aware of it through that. The great Fred Eckhart, who is one of the early beer writers in America, Portlander.
Yep.
He got really into sake, so it was floating in my consciousness, but I didn't really know. There was a lot of stuff about sake brewing I didn't know. So I went, did a really serious tour at Sake One and tried to learn everything I could. I would love to have gone to Japan, but it wasn't in the budget. I plan to go to one of those 600-year-old sake breweries.
You need to write a sake book,
just
on its own merit, on its own.
And I feel like since this is kind of we got a New Jersey theme going on here. I want to say, thanks to Jeff Cialetti, famous New Jerseyan, and I think the sake bard of the United States, who really helped guide me and keep me straight. I always rely on experts, and he's written a sake book, which is very good, and he has toured those breweries, in Japan, and so I was clarifying everything I could with him to make sure I got it right. So I think it's pretty accurate.
Yeah, and it's been really cool to see the crossover. You see a lot of breweries, some will use sake yeast or some kind of sake influences, whether it be grains and stuff like that, more specifically in like pilsners and lagers and stuff like that in the States as of late. And it's just cool to see that kind of influence. Again, it's kind of one of those things where you're talking about the English kind of being like, oh, should we really do these American hops in our beers? And just absorbing that information, that flavor profile, and putting it in all together, homogenized. We're a melting pot of deliciousness. That's what beer is, baby.
It's true, and I appreciate all cultures, and one thing I appreciate about the United States is we are so receptive to these different cultural influences, and so sake is a good example. You've got a brewery here in New Jersey, or up the road from you in New Jersey, and Americans are like, well, there's this cool craft product that I'm really into, and instead of thinking like that's somebody else's, we think, oh, I'll just do this thing. I'm going to make sake. It's not the kind of thing that probably occurs to, if you're living in Poland, you don't think like I'll start a sake brewery. But Americans do. That's the kind of plucky arrogance of Americans, which is great.
Drink sake and enjoy. But awesome, man. I'm gonna have to let you go. You got to start setting up and get ready for the Q&As.
This has been a really fun conversation.
Yeah, dude.
You've asked really nice questions.
Thank you.
I've done some press, and I've gotten asked some less interesting
dumb stuff
questions.
is what it's called. Yeah, I'll say it. You don't have to. Where do they find you? I know you have the Beervana blog, you have the Beervana podcast, you have the Beervana book. What's the best way? Just beervana.com?
BeervanaBlog.com.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the blog. Beervana.com is owned by somebody else.
You need to get it.
Yeah, I've tried to get it, and I don't know. Anyway, it's so BeervanaBlog.com, and all the info is there, including this. I'm just starting a book tour, so if you're
that's what I was going to say. Yeah. Where are you headed?
After today at Bond Place. Well, I don't know when this is going to drop.
So I'll try to get this up this week. So Wednesday, Thursday.
So this is the East Coast swing, and I'm going to be in Haley's Harp in Metuchen, John Hall's hometown, tomorrow, and I will be in New York City at Torch and Crown on whatever the day is after that, Wednesday.
Good loggers.
And Guinness on Thursday in Baltimore.
Maryland.
Yeah. And then and then after that I do a Midwest swing, Minneapolis, Madison, Wisconsin, Chicago, West Coast swing, Denver, San Diego, LA, San Francisco, and a Southern swing, Atlanta, North Carolina, 2 stops. Maybe forgetting something, but Austin. And then New England, Boston, or Salem in Notch, Salem, Massachusetts. And,
lager chugs again.
Yes, exactly. And Freeport, Maine, not Portland, Maine, pretty close to that.
Finishing up the tour up in New England to visit the rents, the step rents.
That's right. My wife, we're doing that around Thanksgiving, so we'll be there anyway.
Nice.
So it's nice to tag that on. The last stop so far is Maine Beer Co. So one of my big faves.
That does not suck.
Yeah, it does not suck.
Well, thank you very much, brother, for joining
Thank
us.
you.
Go check them out. If they wanted to buy the book, what's the best place they could buy the book? Or you just don't care?
I don't care in one way, but if you're interested, if you can't make a book tour stop and you're interested in having a signed copy, every stop I go to, I will sign books and leave them behind. So you can go online and look at where I've been, look at the local bookseller, and if you act quickly, you can probably buy a signed copy from one of those places. So
And
that's
for those of you listening local to this, it would be Moravian Books in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And then what was the bookstore out in Carton? Out in Atlantic Highlands?
Road.
River Road.
Is
Do
that
you know
right?
the Metuchen one? What was it again?
I don't know because I haven't
Well,
had it
if
yet.
you don't know, write me and I'll let you know.
And
How
it's,
about that?
And it's on the blog too. That
There you
info
go.
is there.
Yeah,
so.
go check it out. So thank you very much, brother. Let's go set up. You can go get some Q&As in and we can drink some more beer.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Cheers,
This was
brother.
really fun.